Welcome to Introduction to Talmudic Legal Logic, and this lecturette discusses some texts that are referenced in our conversations, texts that precede the Talmud, and talks a little bit about when they happened, how they were edited and redacted, and what material evidence do we have as to their production. So, the place to start, of course, is to talk about the Hebrew Bible. As many of you probably know, doctrinal religious approaches are that the Bible was divinely written and provided to Moses on Mount Sinai. But scientific approaches to the Hebrew Bible have much more pluralistic approaches to this. And you can find some of them if you just go to any online bookstore and you look up who wrote the Bible, and you'll find a lot of books and a lot of theories about this. Generally speaking, people who have scholarly scientific perspectives on the authorship of the Hebrew Bible understand this not as one book, but as an assortment of books, not just one, but many, written by many authors in many periods. How we try to date each of these books and figure out when and by whom it was written has to do with the scientific methodology that's applied to this, and scholars will sometimes use philological evidence, which is to say they will analyze the biblical language, trying to figure out layers of language by time. Sometimes they will have references to external events, like when a historical event is mentioned in a biblical book, the level of accuracy, the references to real people that we have historical evidence actually existed can help us date the text. And sometimes references to material culture in the text might correspond to material findings that were found in digs, in archaeological digs around the Middle East, and can help us figure out when this book was authored. There are also theories involving who wrote these books, and these are source theories. And serious discussions of source theories start around the 19th century, and the basic premise is that different people who wrote these stories have had different agendas and different ideologies that they've tried to serve with the text. Now, it's not necessarily the case that each book was authored by one person. Indeed, there are several books in the Bible that seem to reflect more than one source. There's a lot of evidence that later editing happened, that a lot of stories were created or crafted to mirror other stories, that there had been people who redacted the story after it was written. So all of these layers are very much a matter of scientific examination. The upshot of this for our discussion is that stories that depict a particular historical period were usually, although not always, written at a later period. So if a story is telling you, for example, about the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, as the Joseph story in Genesis does, the story itself was not authored during the time of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, and because of that, the sensibilities and the agendas that the story reflects may apply to things that were talked about at a much later time in history and were relevant at a later time, and this story is just serving as some kind of a metaphor or a legend, if you will, that is supposed to address the concerns that people had in the here and now, say during the Hellenistic period. Now, because these sources had all kinds of values, agendas, ideologies, things that they were trying to advance with these stories, this raises a lot of editorial questions about how come certain books came to be included in the biblical canon, whereas other books got left out. And we know that there is quite a number of books that date to the same time that the biblical books were written, but stayed outside. We call those apocryphal books. And those are sometimes interesting in terms of comparing the stories from the outside to the stories that got included in the canon, and it raises lots of interesting editorial questions about why some things ended up inside, whereas other things got left out. In some cases, the things that got left out because their literary value was not great or they were boring. In other cases, it's precisely because they're too wacky and interesting to be included in the canon. And this, of course, reflects the agenda of the redactor or the editor, right? Alongside the apocryphal books, we also have texts that were found in the Qumran caves in the desert of Judah near the Dead Sea, which you can see here in the picture. And those too can now be carbon dated, so we know when they were written. A lot of them contain parallels to books of the Hebrew Bible or to apocryphal books. Some of them are independent compositions altogether, but this also helps us kind of try to figure out how to date the biblical stories. To give you an example of why biblical story dating is important, I want to raise this question using one example that's interesting to me professionally, and that's the issue of prison and incarceration stories in the Bible. So, I've looked at five stories that involve putting people in confinement situations and incarceration situations. The incarceration of Joseph in Egypt, putting Samson in Gaza, the Philistines capturing Samson after having lots of skirmishes with him and finally capturing him and torturing him. Jeremiah, who gets put in different prisons and jail facilities in Jerusalem under siege, under Babylonian siege. The adventures or misadventures of Daniel and Esther, respectively, in Babylonia and Persia. And each of these stories is talking about or telling you a story about a particular place, right? So the Joseph story tells us something about the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. So if we were to take it on its own terms, we would assume that it was written in minus 1800, so 1800 before Common Era. Similarly, Samson in Gaza is a story that reflects the period of the Judges. So this is before the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which we usually date to around 1000 before the Common Era. And the story of Samson would be a little bit before that, a couple of centuries before that, right? The Daniel and Esther stories date to around the 6th century because they both pertain to the short-lived Babylonian Persian exile, right? That's a short period of time, right? And the Jeremiah story pertains to the siege on Jerusalem, so shortly before that. But if you're looking at these stories through the lens of philological analysis, material culture, trying to figure out what sort of sensibilities and values they reflect, you come up with very different answers to this. So, for example, the Samson story likely was added to the canon or told in the canon much later than the period that it purports to reflect. So, probably somewhere around the 8th century BC, right, is probably when we're talking about the Samson story. Similarly, the stories of Daniel and Esther, even though they talk about Babylonia and Persia, they reflect a lot of things that have to do with Hellenistic sensibilities, Hellenistic perspectives on Babylonia and Persia, which means that they were probably written during that time. The book of Daniel actually references historical events, it dresses them up as prophecy, and it talks about the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes and has some material that suggests the culture war of the Greek era, but it doesn't reference the death of Antiochus. So we think it's before zero, right? Kind of like, minus 60 something. Because there are a lot of similarities in the plot of the Daniel, Esther, and Joseph stories, and because there are a lot of language similarities, it's possible that even the Joseph story, which on its own terms tells of a period that's much, much, much older, was actually written then. Out of the five stories that I've described to you, there is one story that probably was written at the time that it describes, and that's the Jeremiah story. It's so full of vivid, realistic details about the siege of Jerusalem that it was probably written by Jeremiah himself or by a Jeremiah sympathizer around the time of the Babylonian siege. So that just gives you some idea about the fact that we have to keep in mind that we read the story literally on its own terms, but when we look at it through a historical critical approach, we have to remember that when the story was written is not necessarily the time that the story speaks of. So let's talk a little bit about dates in general and to what extent these things are reflecting things that have actual history that you can touch. So, the first time that we find a material object that actually has biblical text on it dates to about 600 BCE, and that's the time where we find two tiny, tiny, tiny silver scrolls in a place called Ketefinom. And the scrolls have cuneiform writing on them. It's, again, very, very tiny. And what it has is a couple of verses from the Book of Numbers, basically the priestly blessing, which appears in the Book of Numbers. So, this is the first documentation that we have of this as a written text. We don't know whether the whole book of Numbers was written then, but we know that at least part of it was. Then we also have an amazing finding in Jerusalem, the digging of the Siloam Tunnel. So during the reign of King Hezekiah, Jerusalem was under Assyrian siege, and what they did was dig a tunnel to divert the water of the stream Gihon into the city so that they would have water and survive the siege. This is a time of great optimism. There's a lot of sort of uprising in spirit of the people in the kingdom of Judea, And the tunnel itself is truly an engineering marvel at a really amazing scale. And we have this amazing writing that was found in the tunnel that documents the moment at which the people who were digging the tunnel, this is what's cool about this, is they were digging the tunnel blind from two ends. And at that time, they wouldn't have had the kind of imaging that we have now that would allow them to precisely calculate when they're going to meet. And this documents the moment of joy in which the diggers on one side can hear the sound of the axes of the diggers on the other side, and they finally make a hole and they meet, and the tunnel is completed, right? I have a lot of fondness for this because it's a moment of secular joy about human accomplishment that speaks just amazing things about human ingenuity and invention. So this has been dated to 700, 600 BCE, and that's another piece of evidence of writing at the time, of the existence of the kingdom at the time, and sort of grounds us in sort of the House of David days of Judea. Then we have a couple of dates that have been confirmed historically. So we know when the Babylonian exile happened because there are Babylonian texts that confirm this. There are other historical sources, external sources. There's material evidence that was found to document the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first temple. We also have documentation as to Xerxes, the Persian emperor who then vanquishes the Babylonians, who generally espoused this idea of plurality of religion, pluralism, and allowed the Jews to come back to their ancestral homeland and go back to their religion, reestablish the temple. The Persian return is dated to 538. So traumatic as the Babylonian exile was, it actually only lasted about 50 years, right? And then the Jews were able to go back and rebuild the second temple. The second temple is important for our purposes because the second temple is the time at which the Mishnah, one of the texts we'll be talking about, was written, edited, and redacted. During around the same time, there is a sect, and we are not sure exactly who was in the sect, who was out of the sect. Lots of interesting theories in literature about this. People who lived in the desert and wrote scrolls, or edited scrolls, or compiled scrolls, and kept them in the caves of Qumran. We can now use carbon dating tools to date the Qumran scrolls. There's a wide range of dates, and largely the texts that we found there's a huge wealth of texts, are dated from 200 BCE to 100 AD, so during the times of the Second Temple and slightly after. We also have vast evidence in Roman sources and in other sources for the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD and the massive exile of Jews to other countries, to Rome and to the Roman provinces. Lots of documentation of the removal of the tools of the temple. And this is a massive trauma that essentially puts an end to the temple days, to the sacrifice days, to the vestiges of the biblical religion, and calls for this need to innovate or do something or address the trauma of exile in some way. And as we're going to find out, one of the ways to do this was to gradually shift away from that to a text-based society and start off the historical process that led to the authority of the rabbis and to the composition of the Talmud. The last event that we have in the territory that, is now, modern Israel and the surrounding region is the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which was the last rebellion of the Jews against the Romans. Again, we have coinage, we have other material evidence that confirms the dates of the rebellion, 132 to 136. This is a big event for Jews, but like for the Romans, it was just a blip on the screen. But it was a huge blow for morale, even for the people who were already in exile in Rome. And those are the people of whom we'll be speaking when we read the Talmud. So these are our important dates, and in future lecturettes, I'll talk more about the texts and what sort of sensibilities they reflect.